My mom's actually a immigrant from Nazi-occupied Holland. They fled World War II, like many others, and ended up coming to Canada to be safe because they lost everything. My Oma and Opa lost everything. They lost their house with bombings. They lost their heart. They lost a lot of their soul from that war. It was really difficult. And my mom tells me some of the stories, and it's really hard to hear. So they came to Canada. My dad is from Lac Saint Anne and the Michelle First Nations. In 1958, I believe, the Michelle First Nation had their land taken away through a referendum vote and promised land in exchange for becoming Canadian citizens, and they never got that land, so they all traded, and it was a very difficult, I guess, referendum within the band on that specific reservation, because it was like 49-51. It broke apart families. It caused a lot of hurt. A lot of families ended up going to Lac Saint Anne, to the Métis settlement. We had family members go to Alexis, Alexander. We even have family members on Satina, near Calgary, on Morley, on all of them around. So we just kind of scattered after that happened. So my koka, my grandma, was actually quite a similar, devout in Catholicism through pain from the community. She gave her life to Catholicism and is devout in those teachings and raised those in my dad. But when I was really, really young, my dad really started to pull away from those teachings and really went deep into our First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis teachings, to go back to the real root of who we are. So I was raised very community-based in Indigenous communities and teachings because my dad refused to participate in, or really he didn't refuse, but he didn't want us raised Catholic. He wanted us raised really understanding both worlds and understanding how important it is of who we are to be Indigenous and be proud of it.
What is the religion? Both worlds, you said. Okay, you got the Catholic side, the Catholic side. What is the other side?
It's just your everyday spirituality, your connection to the land, your connection to water, the connection to all the animals of this land. Like the teachings are that, the white colonial teaching is like we're the top of the pyramid. We are the owners of everything. But the teaching that is the teaching of the land, of our people, is that when Creator went to the animals and said, I'm going to bring this two-legged beast to the world, will you give your life and take care of this? This beast, this animal's going to be hairless and no fangs and no claws. It's going to be the lowest of all of the animal kingdom. Will you give your life to care for this creature that I'm going to put on this earth? And all the animals agreed. They agreed to give their life to sustain us. And that's why when we eat animals, we pray to that spirit of that animal and have gratitude, because that's our brother and sister animal who's given its life to keep us alive, into the great agreement between the Creator and the other animals. So it's really quite opposite of the colonial ideology that is taught out there. I really delved into adoption, learned some really awful things about international adoptions.
Like what? Just briefly.
So some of the really awful things are that, like say if you go to Eastern Europe, a lot of those kids have traumatic births. A lot of them have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. A lot of them have attachment disorder. They have, because they've never been touched, they've never been loved. They just kind of get thrown on the side of the road. And then you adopt these children. It costs thousands of dollars. You bring them home, and then there's no support for them when you bring them to Canada, because you've chosen to bring them here. So in China, when it was the girls in orphanage crisis of like the 90s, 2000s, where baby girls were abandoned, it was 6 figures to go and adopt a child from that country. And there were rules where you had to be within a certain body mass index. You had to both have degrees. You had to. Now this, remember, was in 2005. I don't know what the rules are now, because I have many children and I'm not looking to adopt internationally. But some of those things, or even in like African countries we looked at, and I learned that, and this was the start of coming back to my culture, was where I learned that guerrilla organizations were paid by white people to go into villages and murder mothers and steal their children and put them up for adoption. And I was mortified. When I found that out, it took me back to the beginning of colonization in this country, where white settlers came in and stole the children to adopt, sell, child trafficking to white families. And it stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't, as soon as I found that out, I was beside myself. And I talked to my husband about it, and I said, we need to adopt from here. Why are we doing this? Like, what are we doing? And it took a lot of conversation from both of us, and a lot of going to my parents and his parents, and then started talking to elders, and just learning more about our social system, that like 72% of kids in care are First Nations. And that's in Alberta. That's an Alberta number. 72% of kids in Alberta care have Indigenous blood running through their veins. The systemic racism that happens within our child protection system is just awful and heartbreaking. And I was like, if we're going to bring children into our home, I want to bring children of my culture, of my community. Well, like, what are we doing here? So, we started going to social services and adoption sessions and meetings and learning. And we started going through the process of adopting a social local adoption. So funded by the government, not a private social interaction. A private adoption agency. We went through a social adoption agency through social services. Specifically, when it comes to indigeneity, a lot of these things are federally regulated, which is what airlines falls under. We don't actually really fall under different provinces. So we're mostly attached to Keeping National. And some of those gains are like the recognition of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, or what used to be known as Orange Shirt Day. So that's now put in place. We do have 5 cultural days that are, I believe they're unpaid cultural days, but specifically in terms of traditional teachings like powwow or food gathering, hunting, any type of traditional ceremony, we can have up to 5 work days given, or 5 days off given for those traditional moments. I am trying to seek and make change to have the wording of family changed, because family is not a colonial structure for us. It's not a man and a woman and 2.5 children and one set of grandparents each. I have 10 grandmas, and if they die, I have traditional ceremony that I have to go to support them. So having bereavement days that are only for people that you're biologically related to doesn't really work for Indigenous communities. Family is very different. Like, I have 5 children. I have friends who take care of their nieces who are their children, but they don't actually are their guardians, but they're their children. They raise them, they take care of them. So changing the wording around what a family is to the more traditional realm of what a family is, and breaking down those barriers and giving those teachings. Also, when it comes to gender identity, that, we talk about male, female, two-spirit is an Indigenous, like it's a very specific Indigenous teaching of the two-spirit ones, and they carry the strength of the man and the woman. And these teachings need to be recognized, where if we have a male who has female parts, when they breastfeed, well, why would we call it breastfeeding? Why can't we call it chest feeding? So just changing the language to more inclusive language to make people feel safe in their workspace. I think my biggest legacy push that I want before I retire or cross over to the greatest hunting land ever, is I really want to decolonize structures of how we deal with people. So what I would love to see, that I think, if I could have a magic wand and I could get my 3 wishes, it would be an Indigenous person in an executive seat at every local in QP. I would like to see support, so the Indigenous Council in every province, working with each local to make sure that their Indigenous workers are supported properly. Within the local, using restorative justice to deal with conflict. So removing the tables, that's a colonial construct, and putting it in a circle and talking and getting to know each other and making those connections. But also understanding that not every Indigenous person has those teachings. So these are the teachings from me and my community. It could be different in BC. It could be different but that's why it's so important to have Indigenous councils in every province to support those local Indigenous executives on every local, supporting the Indigenous community, bringing those teachings to the table and making it a common way of managing people is through the Indigenous lens and Indigenous teachings.